She asked on Sunday evening, when I was washing up and she was leaning against the kitchen door frame with her bag already packed by the front door. And she said it in the casual register of someone who had rehearsed it into sounding casual and almost succeeded. She said, "Would it be strange if I stayed an extra day or two?" I said, "It wouldn't be strange." She said, "I can sleep on the sofa. I don't want to put anyone out." I said, "You've been sleeping on the sofa." She said, "Yes." "Right," she paused. She said, "Is that a yes?" I looked at the glass I was washing. I looked at her in the doorframe with her arms crossed in the way she crossed them when she was trying to seem unconcerned. I said, "The sofa is there." She stayed 4 more days. I am getting ahead of myself. But I want you to know that up front, because the rest of this is about how a weekend visit becomes 4 days, and how 4 days becomes something neither of us had any particular plan for on the Friday evening when she arrived with a bag meant for 2 nights and a very specific energy that I had been pretending not to notice since the moment she walked in. Her name was Clem Adeyemi. She was 29. She was my roommate Danny's university friend. They had been close for 6 years. The kind of close that produces a specific easiness in a room. The kind where 2 people have enough shared history that they can be quiet together without it meaning anything wrong. She visited 2 or 3 times a year. I had met her 4 times before this weekend. Those 4 times had produced in me a kind of low-level attentiveness I had been treating as ordinary friendliness toward Danny's friend, which is a category of self-deception I would not recommend. My name is Isaac Osai. I am 31 years old. I work in data analysis for a logistics company, which means I spend my days looking for patterns in numbers that tell a story different from the story the surface suggests. I am, professionally, quite good at this. I had not been applying it to my own situation, which is a failure mode I've noticed in people who work with information all day. We save our pattern recognition for problems that pay. I live in a 2-bedroom flat with Danny Farr, who is 29 and works in sound production and is the kind of person who fills a room at a reasonable volume, which is a useful quality in a roommate. We have lived together for 3 years, and it has been genuinely good, which I mention because it is relevant to the specific complication of the following weekend. Clem arrived on a Friday at 6 in the evening. She had dark hair cut short, which I noticed because it was shorter than the last time, and she had the kind of face that was easier to look at directly than it was to look away from, which I had noticed before and had filed under irrelevant. She had a canvas tote bag she put down by the door, as though it had decided where to live. She shook my hand in the hallway, which was formal in a way that was also slightly funny, and she said, "I always shake your hand. We always do this." I said, "Every time." She said, "It's a thing." I said, "It's absolutely a thing." Danny came out of his room and said, "Are you 2 doing the handshake again?" We said nothing. She slept on the sofa. She was a considerate house guest, the kind who asks before using things and leaves spaces cleaner than she found them, and does not eat the last of anything without replacing it. Danny and she had plans for Friday night and most of Saturday, which left me with an approximate awareness of her presence in the flat when she came back, and the specific awareness of someone who is trying not to be aware of a specific thing. Saturday evening, Danny had a project come up, something that required him to go to a studio and could not be rescheduled, and he said, "Sorry, mate." He said it to both of us. He said, "Isaac will look after you," and left, which I noted at the time as an interesting choice of phrasing. So it was the 2 of us on a Saturday evening in a flat that suddenly had a lot of quiet in it. She said, "We don't have to do anything. If you had plans." I said, "I didn't have plans." She said, "I can read or whatever. I have a book." I said, "I was going to make dinner." You could eat. She said, "That is the most grudging invitation I have ever received." I said, "I didn't mean it to sound grudging." She said, "I know. That's what made it charming." She sat at the kitchen counter while I cooked, which is a configuration that produces, in my experience, either stilted conversation or the best kind, and this was the best kind. She asked about my work and actually listened, which I had noticed she did. She had done it all 4 previous times, and I had told myself it was general social competence, and not the specific variety of paying attention that means something. She told me about hers. She ran the social media and content side for a small architecture firm in Edinburgh, which she said required her to make interesting the kind of thing that is genuinely interesting, but photographically shy. I said, "Like what?" She said, "Structural decisions. The parts people live inside without seeing." She looked at me steadily and said, "The invisible load-bearing stuff." I said, "That does sound hard to photograph." She said, "You find ways." We ate at the kitchen table. We talked until the table had been cleared and we were still talking, and moved to the sofa, and were still talking at midnight, at which point she said, "I should let you sleep." I said, "I'm not tired." She said, "Nor am I." We stayed up until 1 in the morning talking about the kind of things you talk about when you have run out of the preliminary conversation and are into the actual one. And at some point I noticed that she had pulled her knees up on my end of the sofa and was turned toward me in a way that was the opposite of someone planning to leave soon, and I filed this under the correct heading for the first time all weekend, and felt the particular clarity of a pattern becoming legible. She went to her sofa. I went to my room. I lay on my bed for 20 minutes understanding that Sunday was going to be difficult. Sunday was, in fact, difficult. Danny came back in the morning cheerful and unaware that the flat had shifted in some imperceptible but total way in his absence. We had a slow morning, the 3 of us, which was easy and warm, the kind of Sunday a flat produces when everyone in it is comfortable. She started packing her bag in the afternoon. I watched from the doorway without meaning to be watching from the doorway. She asked at 6 to stay an extra day or 2. Danny said, "Obviously, yes, stay." He looked at me. I said, "The sofa is there." She stayed. Monday she was in the flat while Danny was at the studio and I was working from home. And we operated in the same space with the particular ease of people who have established that they can be in a room together without it being a performance. She made coffee and left a cup on my desk without asking. I made lunch and called through from the kitchen without thinking about whether to. At 2 in the afternoon she came and stood in the doorway of the room I was working in and said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "The handshake." I said, "What about it?" She said, "I started it the second time we met because I was nervous the first time, and you seemed very contained, and I wanted something that was ours, something specific." She looked at me steadily. She said, "I am explaining this because I think it is probably relevant information, and I have been sitting on it since Saturday evening." I said, "Clem." She said, "I'm not finished." I said, "Sorry. Go ahead." She said, "I told Danny I was coming this weekend because I wanted to see him." That is also true. She paused. She said, "But there was an additional reason that I have been managing carefully since Friday, and the managing it has been significantly more effort than I budgeted for." I said, "What was the additional reason?" She said, "You." She said it simply, with the direct register of someone who has decided that the careful version is more expensive than the honest one. She said, "I have been coming to this flat for 2 years and finding reasons that are also real reasons, and you shake my hand every time, and I started that, and I have been thinking about why I started that since the second time it happened." She said, "I asked to stay because leaving on Sunday felt like." I asked to stay because I wasn't ready to. The flat was very quiet in the Monday afternoon way, which is a specific kind of quiet. I said, the handshake. She said, yes. I said, I've looked forward to it. Every time. I said, I have been treating that as a normal thing to look forward to, and I have been incorrect about that. She said, probably. I said, I noticed your hair on Friday. She said, I cut it in October. I said, I know. You'd had it longer the previous 3 times, and I noticed it was different, and I noticed, and I decided noticing was fine and meant nothing, and I have been deciding that all weekend. She was quiet for a moment. She said, does it mean something? I said, I think it means the same thing the handshake means. I said, I think it means I have been paying close attention to you for 2 years and finding ways to explain that to myself that do not require me to do anything about it. She looked at me from the doorway with the particular expression of someone who has said a brave thing and is watching to see what the landing looks like. She said, Danny is going to find this very satisfying. He is going to be insufferable about it. I said, he said, I'll look after you. She said, I noticed that. I said, he knows, doesn't he? She said, he has known for approximately 18 months. He has been. She paused. She said, he has been creating opportunities. She said it in the tone of someone arriving at information while speaking it. She said, the studio project. I said, Saturday evening. She said, he is an extraordinarily unsubtle person. I said, he really is. She uncrossed her arms. She stepped out of the doorway. She sat in the chair across from my desk, which was a shorter distance than the doorframe, and she set her hands in her lap in the open way that means someone has put something down they had been holding. She said, I don't know what the shape of this is. I live in Edinburgh. You live here. I said, I know. She said, I'm not saying that to make it complicated. I said, I know. It is complicated, she said, but I stopped being able to pretend it wasn't something at approximately 11:30 on Saturday night, and I have been trying to decide whether to say it since, and I am saying it now, because Monday is almost over, and I told myself if I didn't say it by Tuesday, I was going to get on a train and not say it, and I did not want to not say it. I said, I'm glad you said it. She said, Are you? I said, Clem. She looked at me. I said, I looked forward to a handshake. I have been inventing reasons why that was normal for 2 years. I said, you staying 4 extra days is the best thing that has happened in this flat since I moved in, and I have been avoiding saying that out loud all weekend, and I am saying it now. She said, 4 days. I said it because I couldn't make myself say 2 weeks. I said 2 weeks would also have been fine. She said, I know that now. I reached across the desk. She looked at my hand for a moment and then put hers in it, and neither of us said anything for a while, and the flat was quiet in the specific Monday afternoon way, and nothing about the situation had become simple, but it had become honest, which is the better trade. Danny came home at 7. He looked at the 2 of us in the kitchen, which he did in the specific way of someone who has been engineering a situation and is now observing its resolution. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, finally. He opened the fridge. He said, I have been extremely patient. She said, you sent yourself to a studio on a Saturday night. He said, I had a session. She said, Danny. He said, I had a session that I was able to reschedule at the last minute. These are not the same as not having a session. He took out leftovers. He said, are you staying the week? She looked at me. I said, if she wants. She said, I have calls I can take from anywhere. Danny said, great, and heated up his food. He said, To no one in particular. I would like it noted that I never said a word. She said, "You were enormously subtle." He said, "Thank you." She stayed the week. She went home on a Saturday, 7 days after she had planned to, with a train ticket she had changed twice, and the kind of goodbye that was not a goodbye in the way that word usually means. The weekends became regular. Edinburgh to here, then here to Edinburgh, then the question of which direction made more sense, becoming gradually less theoretical. She moved south in the spring, which was the right decision for reasons that were also real reasons, and were additionally because of me, which she said plainly, and I said the same. 2 years later, when people asked how we met, Danny said she visited for the weekend and then asked to stay longer. He said it with a satisfaction that remained completely undiminished by time. She said, "I came to see my friend and found a reason to stay." I said, "She shook my hand the first time we met, and I have been thinking about it since." Danny said, "This is true." He said, "I was aware of this for approximately 18 months. He said, "I was very patient." She said, "You rescheduled a studio session." He said, "I had a session." Nothing had changed, really. She still shook my hand when she arrived somewhere, sometimes, when she felt like it, and we both knew why, and neither of us explained it. Danny still found the whole thing satisfying in the low-level, ongoing way of someone who considers himself partially responsible for a good outcome. She still made coffee and left a cup somewhere I would find it. I still called through from the kitchen without thinking about whether to. The only difference was that the flat she moved into in the spring was not Danny's flat. It was mine. And the cup was always on my desk. And the bag she put down by the door on the first Friday had finally decided where it lived. It had probably always been her. 4 visits, 1 handshake repeated, 2 years of finding reasons, and a weekend that ran over its edges because neither of us was ready for it to end. I just needed her to ask to stay a little longer to understand that the answer I wanted to give was longer than she had asked for. What would you have done if your roommate's friend asked to stay an extra day and you realized you didn't want her to leave at all? And have you ever had someone visit your life as a guest and quietly become the reason the place felt like home? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.